So, you want to do a solo flawless run of Ghosts of the Deep. Well, I'm here to give you some tips and tricks that might help you get that done. A few things before we begin. The video is going to be broken up into a couple of different segments. The first half is mostly going to be general tips for the encounters, stuff like enemy spawns, how some of the enemy AI behaves here and there, etc. Mostly things that are going to apply to every single class with any loadout that you're going to use. The second half is going to be specific strategies geared towards each class, things like your specific loadouts, mods, subclass things to think about. As always, I've got timestamps for you in the description below, and if you want to see an example run of the dungeon from start to finish, I'm going to try and trim out my run from yesterday's stream and link it in the description as an unlisted video if you want to watch any specific part. But fair warning, that will be almost 3 hours long, so feel free to scroll through that if you care to watch it at all. As always, thank you so much for watching. Let's get started. Stats, as always, aren't super complex. You're just going to want to make sure you have 10 resilience for maximum possible damage resistance and probably high recovery if possible, or at the very least some other consistent way to get healing if you don't have high recovery. For the first encounter, you're honestly going to want to run just about whatever you want, as long as you can use it to clear ads and stay alive. The wizards here do have arc damage, so Risk Runner is not bad. It's what I believe I used in my other runs after my first one where I used Osteostriga, which I also thought was very good. And I also did like having a machine gun for my heavy here, but if you want to go a little faster, you could use something like an Eager Edge Sword to speed past certain portions. Since you need to remember your symbols, I recommend just typing them in the chat if you're on PC or if you happen to have a keyboard plugged into your console. Once you finish the first encounter, I just recommend keeping the same loadout on unless you have anything specific you want to switch to. That's what I did, was just keep my loadout from the first encounter, and I felt like those loadouts worked pretty well for this section. The underwater sections are actually easier to do solo in my opinion, since you don't need to worry about teammates taking bubbles for the pressure buff. Just be careful in the sections with enemies here as always. Just stay safe and clear as best you can, although if you're confident enough, you can just sprint past them if you'd like. I chose to clear them out and then move forward, but you can do whatever you want. Once you reach the second encounter, get ready for a potentially long fight with this boss. Ekthar has a ton of health, but with the right build, you can very easily get him down to a 4-phase. Your damage strat is likely to be close range here, but I'll go deeper into that in the sections for each class, since each class is going to do it a little differently. For the start, you're just going to want to clear the 3 knights and the ogre, which will then activate the deep sight in the middle, and you're going to hit that, check the plates on the side for your symbols, and then head down into the deep. While underwater, the most important thing that I noticed is that this boss's AI does not actually seem to be very intelligent with regards to its pathing. He never really tried to cut me off around corners or anything. Instead, he'd just kind of follow me around, so I made it a rule to always keep him behind me and generally try to never make a turn sharper than 90 degrees while underwater. If I did find myself having to backtrack, I would just loop around instead. If you're worried about the Lightbearer wizards up top, you can choose to spawn them one at a time by interacting with the runes one at a time down below, but that will prolong the encounter significantly. I was doing 3 wizards every single time, and it did feel very manageable, especially since these vestige buffs can be dunked on any of the statues, unlike the rest of the dungeon where they have a specific place that they have to be dunked. Another thing that I really liked and used for all 3 classes was actually the proximity ward mod on my class item, which gives you a free powerful overshield during your finisher, and that does include crushing hive ghosts. Since hive ghost crush locks you in place, this will help prevent you from getting killed while crushing the ghosts and getting your vestige buffs. Once you finally get all 3 vestiges dunked, you're going to have 2 main priorities. The first is going to be pretty much one-shotting the Wellkeeper Knight, and second is going to be bursting down the boss's shield. Once his shield is down, your damage strategy is going to come into play. However, getting that shield down can be tricky depending on what class you're on. For my hunters and my titans, and I go into this a little more in the class-specific sections, but I recommend just using your super for it. For the warlocks, there's a few other options you may have to think about, but I'll again go into that later. Just know that for both bosses, since they have shields, Arbalist is always an option. However, again, I recommend titans and hunters use something else. That's towards the end of the video. This boss does not actually have a stomp mechanic, so you can do DPS at point blank range as long as you're able to survive the incoming damage from everything else in the room. And once you finish off the boss, don't forget to crush his ghost and then just keep moving. For the next traversal section, you can either go slow and safe or sprint through it again. It's all up to you. But once you reach that final boss, you're going to want to get ready to be there for a while. Before you start, get yourself a good glass of water, take a bathroom break, and just get ready. Maybe even request 2 or 3 days off work. That's a joke, but it is going to take a while. I was able to get my Warlock clear down to about 5 or 6 phases, but that was the lowest I was able to do. I'm certain you can optimize it a little more because keep in mind my builds were geared towards safety, not necessarily damage optimization. And my Titan and my Hunter each took 8 phases to clear it. And now again, you could get that also a little lower by using the loadout feature to fast swap between a couple different loadouts, but if you're not used to doing that, then maybe don't try that here. For the purposes of this video, I didn't use this technique, and like I said, I opted for safety loadouts more rather than damage optimized loadouts. You use whatever's best for you. The loadouts here were all actually extremely similar though for what I used. The boss's shield is able to be one-tapped by Arbalest just like Ekthar's shield, so I used that since it's good at long range as well. I used a trace rifle in my energy slot so I'd have double special to get tons of heavy to drop. And then for my heavy, I used a bait and switch Cataclysmic, although really any linear would work. I just picked Cataclysmic because it synergized with my Surge mods, and it did everything else I wanted to do, with bait and switch being the strongest damage buff. Other decent options were Xenophage for consistency, and both Sleeper Simulant and Leviathan's Breath worked quite well within my testing, but they generally required you to use your super to break the boss's shield in most situations, so I personally opted for Arbalest because having the one-tap shield break felt awesome for me at least. The main rule for this boss encounter is don't stop moving if you can. The boss flies pretty high and typically aims at where you are, not where you will be, so if you move around enough, the shots will hit behind you, not on top of you. However, the absolute most important thing to watch out for are going to be the Lucent moths. Anytime the Sword Knight is respawned, expect the boss to spawn a swarm of like 7 or 8 moths. These moths also don't behave like normal moths. Since normal moths try to shield hive combatants in the room, these, however, will just immediately go for the player almost every time. So shoot them down before you lose track of them, since they will just instantly kill you out of nowhere if you're not careful. You can also use the water areas to avoid some of the adds if you need to, but be careful because the moths can follow you into the water areas and you won't be able to stop them if you step into one. The other nice thing to know is that the 3 orange bar Boomer Knights that spawn around the room at the beginning of each phase do not respawn if you kill them. However, again, they will respawn at the beginning of the next phase. So once you kill them, you don't have to worry about them for the remainder of that rotation of the boss. I just liked killing them first so that they were out of the way, and then all I had to deal with were the acolytes and occasional thralls. Once you link up all 3 ritual sites, go and get your vestiges of light like normal. I recommend doing the knight first, since he's the scariest one in my opinion, as his knockback attack is relatively dangerous, and he has a good line of sight on you. He's just the hardest arena out of the 3, in my opinion at least. I'd usually commit a super against this guy if I needed to, since I'd almost always have it back by the time I went to DPS if I needed it. And after your 3rd dunk of a vestige, just do your damage like normal. If you're not using Arbalest, you may want to super the boss for the shield break, depending on what you're using, and then switch to your DPS weapon. Rinse and repeat as many times as you need, and then you're done. Don't forget to grab the ghost as well. It will drop in the air near where the boss dies, so be ready to jump up high and grab it. For class-specific strats, I'm going to go ahead and start with the Titan. Mainly because if you are a multi-class player, then I have to recommend doing this on your Titan, because for the whole dungeon, I was able to use really similar builds. I used Hammer of Soul pretty much the entire time, with this build on your screen here, and the only thing I really changed out was my exotics and a couple mods. For the first and second encounters, I found that Syntheseps was huge, especially for DPS against Ekthar. I used Tractor Cannon and 2 1-2 punch shotguns, although the legendary shotguns are not actually needed. You see, back in Season of the Haunted, Syntheseps and Hammer got a nerf with 1-2 punch since it was being used to just absolutely tear through the Galrun boss. So you don't actually need 1-2 punch to buff the Syntheseps Hammer against this boss. Now, you will see me doing that in the background gameplay. That was mostly just muscle memory. I kind of forgot. I was also just kind of firing my shotguns to try and get a little more damage. The total damage output felt about the same regardless, if I'm being honest. I don't think it really matters whether you just use your hammer or the shotguns. Doesn't really matter. The main reason I used the 1-2 punch shotguns were actually to use the uncharged melees to refresh Roaring Flames, since I could get more damage out of them. Because you see, if you have Roaring Flames up while using Sol Invictus, an uncharged melee can actually make a sunspot. So if I didn't have my hammer, I could at least try to use the 20 seconds Roaring Flames buff to keep that stacked up, keep myself healed, all that. 1-2 punch helps because the hammer does significantly more damage than the uncharged, but 1-2 punch helps the uncharged melee get just that little bit more impact that it needs to realistically kill some of the larger enemies here. But if you want to use something else that isn't these shotguns, feel free to go for it. The last encounter, I did modify the build to look more like this that's on your screen now. I did swap my exotic to the Lorelei helm for more healing, and I used healing grenades too. Pretty much everything else could be killed by the hammer without Syntheseps, and if not one hammer, then definitely two. And Lorelei Splendor helped with the DPS phases by giving me healing with Barricade, and I just set up to have the maximum possible amount of healing I could squeeze out of this build, and I felt like it did really, really well. Hunters, for the first encounter, you can really go with whatever you want. I used a Devour build on Void, but anything is fine, whatever you feel like you can clear and survive with. For the second encounter, I recommend using a similar method to the Titan, although I went with this arc setup here with Liar's Handshake as my exotic. It's still going to be a melee style build, just on arc instead of solar. You will need at least one legendary shotgun with 1-2 punch here, and then tractor cannon just like we used for our Titan. Punching, and dodging, you'll be able to pretty much always have full HP while putting out really high damage if you can keep your combination blow buff stacked, and the jolt will 100% help with the ad clear. To break the boss's shield, you are going to need to use your Gathering Storm super, and then just try to stay safe so that you don't get killed by his shield throws or bum rushed by his melee attack. During the actual damage phases, you are going to have to be a little more aware of your HP bar, since you won't be getting quite as much healing as the Titan, but you will be getting a decent bit back off your melees. Just keep your eyes open and be ready to bail out and heal up against the ads if things get a little dangerous. Remember, it is always better to have one scuffed damage phase and live, keeping the run alive, than die trying to ensure a quicker boss kill. I do recommend all the arc mods that you can get off the artifact here, assuming that you are attempting this in Season 21 when the dungeon was released. For the very final encounter as a hunter, you can keep arc on if you want. I don't think there's much wrong with that, but I personally swapped over to a Void build. I used a Devour build with Gear Falcons, and it felt really great with the Void Breach mods on the artifact this season, just giving me tons of easy access to Devour and Void Overshields at the same time. And I went for Mobius Quiver as the super for an easier time breaking the boss's shield, or if you want, if you're using Arbalist, you could use it for extra boss damage. You can also use it to control ads where needed, and it can be used to shut off the Hive Guardian supers when you go into the side rooms to pick up the vestiges. There are tons of other options too. For example, if you go for Arc, you could just use Assassin's Cowl or even Star Eater Scales for your Gathering Storm. Some solar builds are solid too, using things like Blade Barrage and having your knives up just very consistently. You could also even go for Strand with Woven Mail and Suspend being so good, and the super being great for keeping the ad clear. Really, you have a lot of options. I would tell you don't be afraid to experiment with the variety you have, but if you want my personal recommendation, I would swap to a Void build because Devour is just so good, especially with the Void mods on our artifact. And for my Warlocks out there, you have some variety too. Strand currently has some really strong builds, surprisingly enough, using the Unravel mods on the artifact, and don't forget that you have a new aspect that gives you Suspend, as well as access to Weaver's Trance, giving you more Suspend, and Suspend, as always, is one of the best effects we have right now. Just keeping everything stunned up can buy you a lot of space. Void also has a lot of healing, and with this season's artifact mods, you could drop the Feed the Void aspect for the Echo of Starvation fragment, and then use the artifact Void mods, using the Void Breaches to get you the Overshields and Devour at the same time, or you could keep using Feed the Void anyway to have even more Devour access. Both are perfectly fine. Arc also doesn't do too terribly either, given that Chaos Reach for the shield break against the bosses lets you have a lot of potential for using an exotic heavy weapon, and even then, Arc Souls, while not my favorite things, aren't terrible. It also greatly helps that this season has very good Arc mods on the artifact, so I recommend grabbing all of those if you're going to try it on an Arc Warlock. The best by far, though, and what I used personally, was Well of Radiance. no surprise there, but it lets you have an instant safety button against almost anything. For the first encounter, same as the other two classes, you can run whatever you want. For Ekthar though, I recommend Well with one of two options. The first was a Well using a Sunbracers build that had Legend of Acreus for DPS. The second one was actually a linear fusion build using Arbalest to break his shield instantly. It was basically the same loadout that I was using for the final boss, but for my exotic there, I was using Phoenix Protocol, since the ads are plentiful enough to recharge it easily, but a lot of exotics work now that Starfire is nerfed. There's a lot of room to experiment and figure out what works best for you. Honestly, the final boss on a Warlock isn't terrible. I just ran the exact same thing, Well of Radiance with Phoenix Protocol, mostly since the odds of me having to instant pop a Well to live were very high. If I suddenly got surrounded and needed to just have a instant button that would pretty much keep me alive through anything, Well of Radiance had me. Moths can still kill you in a Well if you tank too many of them at the same time, but pretty much everything else is survivable inside of a Well. Obviously, you'd be using your Well for damage phases too, and a good Heat Rises activation could keep you alive if you didn't necessarily need quite as much healing as offered by Well. Other builds for Warlocks do have a lot of clearing power, but less of a good panic button that'll get you out of anything, so I'd recommend just trying to ask yourself what you personally feel is more important to you and then run with that. You're going to want to experiment, figure out what works best for you, but this is personally just what worked best for me. Well, everybody, that is all the tips that I have, but if you have any specific questions that you want answered, feel free to leave those in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them as I see them. Good luck on your runs, and like I said, if you have any specific questions that you want me to check, builds you want to run by me, put them in the comments. I'll be happy to take a look as soon as I see them. And a lot of the gameplay here was streamed over on Twitch, so if you want to check out some of that live, then feel free to check that out. Like and sub if you liked the video or want to see more from me. And I will see y'all next time. Later, everybody.